Esteemed listeners and friends, we find ourselves discussing the relentless conflict between the Israeli forces and Hamas in the Gaza Strip, a situation that continues to escalate with alarming intensity. The Israeli military has recently heightened its air and artillery assaults on targets within Gaza, a move that has left deep imprints on the region. The Israeli military contends that over 400 targets of the Hamas forces in Gaza have been vanquished. In the midst of this relentless turmoil, a beacon of peace emerged from an unlikely source. Mr. Osama Hamdan, a high-ranking leader of the armed wing of Hamas, who called for a ceasefire on October 24 local time. A disturbing development in this conflict, as reported by Israeli media on the same day, is the use of a weapon known as an earthquake bomb by the Israeli military to obliterate Hamas's underground tunnel systems. However, this report lacks specific details about the timing and scale of this weapon's use. Despite these frightening developments, a senior member from Hamas's political office affirms their preparedness, claiming an armed force of 35,000 fighters in Gaza, outfitted and ready for any scenario, even if the Israeli military receives reinforcement from the United States and Europe. Mr. Hamdan, in his call for ceasefire, urged for intervention from Arab countries, Muslim nations, and the United Nations to halt the Israeli attacks. The urgency to create conditions for humanitarian aid and the import of relief supplies into Gaza was highlighted, a plea that resonates with the dire situation on the ground. These pleas came shortly after the Israeli military spokesperson, General Daniel Hagar, announced their preparedness for the next phase of the conflict, awaiting orders from their national leadership. In a grim revelation, Palestinian health sources reported that close to 300 people lost their lives, with around 500 wounded in the recent Israeli military assaults. Since the morning of October 7, the onset of Israel's offensive campaign in Gaza, casualties have shockingly risen to over 5,800 deaths and over 16,000 injuries. Efforts to alleviate the suffering can be seen in the actions of the Egyptian National Information Center, which reported on October 24 that they had delivered considerable amounts of medicine, food, and drinking water to Gaza in the past 3 days. On the same day, French President Emmanuel Macron visited both Israel and the West Bank. His mission was to express solidarity with Israel, encourage efforts to free hostages held by Hamas, and facilitate humanitarian aid for the Gaza population. In the midst of this escalating conflict, actions by the United States, a staunch supporter of Israel's military campaign, have attracted global scrutiny. The U.S. National Security Council's Strategic Communication Director stated that the U.S. backs the continuation of the current ceasefire, with the immediate priority being the release of all hostages. Yet the U.S. stopped short of advocating for an immediate ceasefire. As the conflict shows no signs of abating, the human cost continues to rise. Our thoughts are with the people affected, and we stay hopeful for a peaceful resolution to this devastating conflict. In an alarming revelation to CNN on October 23, John Kirby, the spokesperson for the National Security Council's Strategic Communications, voiced Washington's stance. The gravitas of the situation is clear. Every single hostage detained in Gaza must be set free prior to negotiations for a ceasefire. This echoes President Joe Biden's sentiments, who has passionately appealed to Hamas to release the hostages before entertaining any thoughts of a ceasefire. The question of whether the White House would consent to a ceasefire in return for the liberation of the hostages saw Biden initially asserting, "We should have a ceasefire." However, a deeper sense of his statement emerged when he clarified that talks of a ceasefire are secondary. It is the freedom of the hostages that assumes precedence. In stark opposition, a senior figure from Hamas resolutely declared no ceasefire in Gaza was imminent, stressing that humanitarian actions should not impede the mission to dismantle Hamas, a sentiment shared by Israel. Michael, a former U.S. ambassador to Israel, poignantly noted on October 23 that a ceasefire would symbolize a victory for Hamas and a defeat for Israel. On the unsettling day of October 23, Hamas revealed to have imprisoned a staggering total of 222 hostages in an offensive against Israel conducted on October 7, a number of whom are foreign nationals. Recently, a glimmer of hope emerged when Hamas released 2 captives, a mother and her child, citing humanitarian reasons. As we speak, on the evening of October 23, 2 more hostages were set free, members of the cautious Anemone armed group, again for humanitarian considerations, and at the behest of Egypt and Qatar. These 2 liberated hostages were also women. Yet, it is a grim reality that Israel has not yet released any hostages. The scope of American hostages held by Hamas has ignited a stark warning from the United States. On October 22, U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin issued a strong statement that if U.S. citizens suffer harm in Gaza, the U.S. reserves its right to self-defense and will not hesitate to retaliate. Austin also disclosed that the U.S. will bolster its military presence in the region to send a stern message to groups seeking to heighten the conflict. Simultaneously, U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken warned that Iranian-backed militias may exploit the chaos to escalate the conflict, and that the U.S. stands ready to respond. These forewarnings from the U.S. surfaced along with Israel's announcement of a forthcoming ground and air assault on Gaza as retribution for the October 7 attack by Hamas, a day that witnessed the tragic loss of over 1,400 Israeli civilians. The volatile situation in Gaza is teetering on the brink chaos with no clear peace strategy in sight. Despite the conclusion of peace summit talks involving Israel and Hamas in Gaza, led by Egypt, no breakthrough agreement was reached. This lack of progress is deeply concerning, especially considering that key players such as Iran, Israel, and the U.S. refrained from participating in the summit. To further complicate matters, the U.S. has deployed the USS Carney near Yemen in a bid to alleviate the escalating tensions. This follows the arrival of the USS Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier in the eastern Mediterranean, raising concerns about the potential for an escalation in the Israel-Hamas conflict. This draws our international news roundup to a close. We deeply appreciate your attention and urge you to keep the people of Gaza and Israel in your thoughts during these turbulent times. Until we meet again, stay safe and informed.